Good morning, Professor Sandra. Please introduce, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kede Agus. I am the moderator of this webinar, and allow me to explain a little bit about the rundowns. So the first, it will be the opening remarks by Bapak Rio, Chairman of Financial Education and Training Agency. And then it will be continued by a keynote speech by Bapak Andin. And then after that, we will go to the three main consecutive presentation. First is from Professor Sandra. And then second, it will be from Ibu Ari Wahyuni. And then the last one from Bapak Budi Waluyo. And then after that, we will have question and answer sessions for about 30 minutes. And the last one, it will be closed by Bapak Iqbal Islami, the Director of PK-BLU. Okay, that's the tentative rundown. And then Bapak Ajwin, can we start?
Okay, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Greetings, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Honorable speakers, and then Director General of Treasury, Chairman of Financial Education and Training Agency, Director of PK-BLU, Head of Financial Department, and then distinguished guests, academics, practitioners, and participants. Welcome to the 23rd Pijar International Webinar. The theme of the webinar is Semi-Autonomous Agencies, Practices and Challenges. And this is an interesting topic in Indonesia because there are a number of BLUs in Indonesia, whether it is in central or local government. And if I'm not mistaken, the number is about 1,200. This webinar is a collaboration between Directorate of PK-BLU, Directorate General of Treasury, and Polytechnic of State Finance STAN, Financial Education and Training Agency. And the webinar is broadcasted through Zoom meeting and also through PK STAN YouTube Live. So I would like also to greet all participants in YouTube Live. And then first, before we continue to the main presentations, I would like to invite Bapak Rionald Silaban, Chairman of Financial Education and Training Agency, to give an opening remark. So please, Bapak Rionald Silaban.
Thank you, Pak Agus. And Excellencies, Pak Andin Hadiyanto, Director General of Treasury, Pak Iqbal Islami, Acting Director of PK and STAN, Pak Tanda Setia, Head of Financial Management Department, and honorable speakers. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, faculty members, and participants. Welcome to the Pijar International Webinar 2020 on Semi-Autonomous Agencies, Practices, and Challenges. My very special thanks to my colleague, Pak Andin Hadiyanto, Director General of Treasury, who will give keynote speech about practices and challenges of semi-autonomous agencies. I believe that all participants will get clear understanding about current issues related to these semi-autonomous agencies. To our prominent speakers, Professor Sandra Thiel from Erasmus University, Ibu Ari Wahyuni, Director of PK-BLU, and Mr. Budi Waluyo, Lecturer from PK-BLU. I would like to thank you all for sharing your thoughts about the concept and implementation of semi-autonomous agencies across Indonesia, including the role of accounting in the agencies. In the early 2000s, Indonesia has experienced rapid democratic reform. The reform euphoria has led to a correction of state administration, including public services. The reform includes, among other factors, the introduction of a semi-autonomous agency model, which transformed public service providers into a new governance of so-called Badan Layanan Umum, or in English, we call it public service agencies. This governance provides financial flexibility to the agencies as an exemption of the general state finance regulations. In order for society to gain better services, management of public service agencies must be improved. Evidently, BLUs are considered a translation of the international trend of agencyfication. The introduction of private expertise into these agencies allows a change in their administrative works and routine. BLU is considered a manifest of the state finance reform within public service agencies, which provides them with the flexibility to adopt business practices to improve their service performance. One of the key characteristics of BLUs is that they have some degree and form of autonomy from higher authority. Thus, I invite my colleagues in ministry, universities, associates, and practitioners to work together to build and develop the implementation of semi-autonomous agencies for better public service provision in Indonesia. Lastly, I hope that you all enjoy the exciting speakers to come. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Pak Rionald Silaban, for giving the opening remarks. Now, we would like to jump to the discussion on the main session. New public management emerged as an approach to improve the quality of public services, increase the efficiency of government operations, and make policy implementation more effective. This phenomenon drove the government to delegate the tasks to at arm's length agencies equipped with flexibility such as financial autonomy, human resource autonomy, and control arrangements. Many countries, including Indonesia, massively adopted semi-autonomous agencies. In this webinar, we will hear directly from the point of view of prominent academics and also policymakers related to the agency's implementation and challenges from the national and international point of views, including the context of agencyfication. Today, we will have keynote speech from Bapak Andin Hadiyanto, and then after that, it will be followed by 3 presentations from 3 main speakers. But before that, I would like to give a short introduction about Bapak Andin Hadiyanto as a keynote speaker. Bapak Andin Hadiyanto is the Director General of Treasury of the Ministry of Finance, starting from 2019. Before that, he positioned as expert staff of the Ministry of Finance for macroeconomics and international finance. He also was experienced as a World Bank Executive Director. He represented 11 ASEAN countries in World Bank, Washington, D.C. He pursued his master and doctoral degree in Graduate School of International Development Nagoya University. And he is also a graduate of Faculty of Economics and Business Gajah Mada University when he pursued the bachelor degree. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bapak Andin Hadiyanto.
Thank you very much, Pak Agus. Excellencies, Bapak Rionald Silaban, Chairman of Finance Education and Training Agencies, Bapak Iqbal Islami, Acting Director of PK-BLU, Professor Sandra van Thiel from Erasmus University Rotterdam, Ibu Ari Wahyuni, Director of PK-BLU, Bapak Budi Waluyo, Lecturer of PK-BLU, and all seminar participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. First of all, our deepest gratitude to the State Financial Polytechnic of Stans as the organizer of this event for giving us the opportunity to deliver a speech regarding the provision of public services by the Public Service Agency, or we call it BLU. Pak Rio in his remark has addressed several characteristics of the institutional reform through BLU. Therefore, we can see that the BLU can play significant roles in providing excellent public services and supporting fiscal sustainability. This is particularly becoming more critical in addressing the economic and social issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are all aware, the most recent global economic condition is still surrounded by the uncertainties due to the pandemics. The OECD projects that the global economy will contract by -3 in the fourth quarter of 2020. For Indonesia itself, we still have to see a negative economic growth at 3.5% in the third quarter of 2020, although this figure is better than the performance in the second quarter of at -5.3%. By observing the development and projection of the global economy, the Indonesian economy is projected to follow these global economic development trends, which will begin to enter into a recovery period at the end of 2021, with a growth target of 5.0% in 2021. The domestic sector is expected to experience a turning point toward greater economic stability. Ladies and gentlemen, participants, in realizing all of this, the Indonesian government, with a package of regulations during this pandemic, uses all government vehicles, such as state-owned enterprises, and also almost all government ministries or agencies, including, and of course, especially BLUs, which are expected to be able to provide service assistance to the public in the field of health, education, and other services that can create a significant multiplier effect reactions. BLU, which is a semi-autonomous government agency in Indonesia, has a significant role on both economy and public service provisions. For example, currently there are 105 health service clusters of BLUs spread across 5 state ministries or institutions. BLU hospitals only amount to 3.4% of the total national hospitals, but they can contribute to the provision of services as much as 13.6% of the total hospital service provision in Indonesia. BLU Hospital is one of the main supporters of the National Health Insurance, or JKN, because 80% of BLU Hospital's patients are BPJS participants. There are also 101 education service clusters of BLU spread across 7 state ministries or institutions. The education unit of BLU serve 1.4 million students at the formal education levels and 150,000 cadets at the vocational education levels, and produce 12,000 research, or almost 67% of the total national research. In addition, as part of the management of the education budget, amounting to 20% of the state budget, throughout 2016-2020, the government has allocated an education budget through the National Education Development Funds, which is also run by BLU. In addition, since 2019, the government has formed a research endowment funds, followed by the establishment of a cultural endowment funds and a higher education endowment fund in 2020. So these endowment funds will be invested, and the proceeds will be used to finance the improvement program quality of human resources and competitiveness of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, besides health and education services, BLU also provides other services such as fund management. One of the roles of this cluster is to overcome the housing backlog and increase the affordability of low-income people to get a livable place to live through the housing financial liquidity facility. This is also BLUs. Others are assisting the empowerment of small and micro enterprises in all sectors, such as agriculture, fisheries, trade, and small manufacturers, which are run by several BLUs in several ministries. BLU may also play or be one of the government tools in covering fiscal mismatch. BLU cash balance can be used as a buffer for government liquidity if they are needed. So this is very helpful and very useful. Arguably, all those achievements and roles above can be attributed to the very characteristic of BLU. The BLU's background as a form of government innovations in providing better services and providing positive economic functions has been felt on track with the government's objective. With its flexibilities on managing its resources, BLU can provide better services to the public and support the treasury functions while having less dependency on the state budget. So for the period of 15 years from 2005, which was the beginning of the BLU being promoted until this year to 2020, currently totaling of 244 BLUs under the central government management has contributed to various strategic government sectors and other productive sectors. This also, we have more than thousands of BLU managed by the local governments. So the improvement and innovation are always on the top agenda of organizations. Thus, we are always striving to provide better services to the public through BLU. So, and one of our strategies is by assessing BLU's maturity levels. Using the method of assessment, we may determine the maturity level of BLU not only by evaluating the output, such as financial and services, but also by looking at the process of creating said output. Hopefully, from this assessment, we can identify which one is performing and which one needs more support and how to support it. Furthermore, assessing BLU that might not be compatible with the semi-autonomous agency model, from the result of the assessment may be advised to implement another model of government agency so the overall contribution to the public can be optimized. That is our brief descriptions pertaining to the role of BLU in Indonesia today. Before we end, again, we appreciate the international seminar held at the STAN State Financial Polytechnics. We hope that with this seminar, we can all see the similarities and differences in the characteristics of semi-autonomous government institution in Indonesia with other countries. Finally, we congratulate you on the series of webinars on semi-autonomous agencies. Hopefully, all of you can participate in this series of seminars very well and can get valuable insight that can be applied in the various fields that you study. May God and the Almighty always guide us all in carrying out service to our beloved nation and country. Thank you and terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Bapak Andin Hadiyanto, for giving the keynote speech, and also for Bapak Rio. Now, we will continue with our main presentations. The first presentations will be Professor Sandra van Thiel. She will explain about the semi-autonomous agencies, concept and practices across countries. And then it will be continued by Ibu Ari Wahyuni from PK-BLU. She will explain about semi-autonomous agencies in Indonesia. And the last but not the least, it will be Bapak Budi Waluyo. He will explain about the role of accounting in agensification. Now, we will jump, before we jump to presentation by Professor Sandra van Thiel, I would like to give a short introduction. Professor Dr. Sandra van Thiel is a full professor in Erasmus School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Department of Public Administration and Sociology. He is also editor-in-chief of International Journal of Public Sector Management. Her research interest is semi-autonomous executive agencies. She has 25 years experience in researching these research interests. And for the education, she has a PhD degree from Research School ICS at Utrecht University. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Dr. Sandra.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll start sharing my screen now. I hope this is all visible to you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to give a presentation about my favorite topic, the semi-autonomous agencies or executive agencies. There are many names being used, and I'll tell a little bit more about that in the presentation. I've already been introduced. I'll explain a little bit more about myself and my background, and then I will go into a number of topics, 4 to be exact. First, I'll tell a little bit about the history of agentification, then go into the different types of agencies in various countries around the world. I'll want to talk about the management of agencies at arm's length by the government, for example, by ministries, but also by municipalities. And I will conclude with a number of lessons for practice. So a little bit more about me. Most of the things have already been said. I am a professor of public management at the Erasmus University, but also at the Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And I've done research into these agencies for 25 years now. I've written a lot about it, but I'm not only an academic researcher, I also frequently give advice to governments and agencies. And one of the things I've put on the slide here is that in 2012, I've led a parliamentary inquiry by the Dutch Senate into this topic. At the moment, there's actually a parliamentary inquiry going on by the second chamber of Dutch Parliament, and I've been interviewed there as an expert on this topic as well. I'm the editor-in-chief of an international journal, but also, and most importantly for this presentation, is that I am a leading member in the so-called COBRA network. And that COBRA network entails researchers from more than 30 countries, all involved in research on government agencies. And you can see the book I put on here on the slide, which is on government agencies, and which actually presents the results of our joint research. One of the things we've done is we've built a large database covering 14 different countries with the same questions. So enough about me, let's delve into the topic of today, namely the agencies. And I would like to start with a definition. It's very difficult to give a definition because agencies are very different in both between countries, but also within countries. There are many different types of agencies, and I will explain a little bit later more about these different types. But in general, you could say that a semi-autonomous agency or an executive agency is an organization which is in charge of a public task, which could be, for example, the implementation of policy, regulation, but also service delivery. But this organization is operating at arm's length of the national or the local government. So it is not a part of the core government apparatus. There is no direct hierarchical relationship as a result. Maybe there was in the past, but now there isn't. When the organization was granted autonomy or semi-autonomy, the direct hierarchical relationship is severed. Now, agencies may differ in all kinds of legal forms, the type of financing and all kinds of internal management conditions, and I'll go into that a little bit later. So it's this attempt to give a definition is to find some common ground, also to enable, for example, comparative research, but it is quite difficult because of all the differences between the countries, but also within the countries, because most countries have different types of agencies within that particular country, different legal forms and different legal types. There are also many different names or labels in use. I've listed a couple of them here. Quengo was at one time very popular as a term, but also statutory bodies, extra-governmental or para-governmental organizations. And there are very specific names relating to particular countries, like the BLU model in Indonesia or the ZBO model in the Netherlands, to give just two examples. So we use the term agensification to refer to the process of the creation of agencies. But again, there are many different other terms that you may encounter when you look into, for example, the academic literature. Again, I've listed only a couple because there are more, but decentralization, autonomization, I think, are the most popular ones. Sometimes privatization, devolution, there are all kinds of names being used depending also on preference in a particular country. Now, it was already briefly mentioned that the creation of agencies is often associated with the advent of the new public management. Now, you should know that the new public management was a label that we academics gave to a series of government reforms that started in the Western world in the 1980s and 1990s. Indeed, as a result of new public management reforms, the number of agencies skyrocketed, as you can see here. You can see here that in the 80s and 90s, the number, particularly the blue line and the yellow line are most important here, the numbers go up really very strongly. But as you can see, there were already agencies before then. So this is the aggregated result of data on 14 countries, 14 Western European countries, I should say. But it is important to note that in many countries, different sorts of agencies were already in existence before the new public management, and they were sort of rediscovered as a vehicle for new public management reforms. One of the examples that is often mentioned is Sweden. Sweden has a very strong tradition of using agencies long before new public management became popular. New public management became popular from the 1980s on, as I said, in particularly the Western world. It became very popular because of the new administrations of Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, as you can see here on the picture. The main sort of idea behind new public management was that government should be reformed because government was not performing well. Businesses were doing better, and by the way, markets are the most optimal way to provide all kinds of services. So government should be reformed to become more like a business. And this quote, "Government is the problem, not the solution," is a quote from Ronald Reagan. And the public management reforms targeted many different aspects of the government. I've listed here the 7 principles of new public management as identified by the British scholar Christopher Hood. Number 4 is actually the one that we are going to look into mostly today, because that is the shift to disaggregation of units in the public sector, which is the creation of agencies. So, like I said, new public management reforms targeted many different aspects of the national government and also of the local government. I've listed here some data, again, on 14 different European countries to show what kind of tasks already have been turned into agencies, have been agensified. So this ranges from meteorology to the land registry to the prosecution office, immigration, the tax office, the distribution of EU subsidies, which is of course important for EU countries, but also developmental aid. So this is a whole range of different tasks that have actually all been agentified to a certain degree or in a particular form. As you can see, the executive agency form here is the most popular one. And the same goes for countries. You can actually see the degree of agentification of these 25 tasks in 21 countries. And you can see here that some countries have actually agentified really a lot. For example, particularly the Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, for example, but also very interesting Eastern European countries. And they have actually got a very different track record when it comes to the creation of agencies, because most of the time they have actually been creating agencies because they were obligated to do so by the European Union. It became part of the rules of accession to the EU to have what they called a modern government apparatus, and that included having agencies for various tasks. Now, as you can see, this is mainly European countries. There's Tanzania in there, which is quite a sort of bit of off, and Israel, but all the other countries are mostly European or Western countries. As far as developing countries go, we know that, for example, the IMF and the World Bank played a similar role as the EU did. So the IMF and the World Bank have made it a requirement for getting donations to have a modern apparatus, which means that a number of agencies created in developing countries have actually been created because it was required by the international donor organizations. The reason why this was required is that the creation of agencies is based on the expectation of very high results. So the creation of agencies is expected to lead to all kinds of economic benefits, like more efficiency, effectiveness, higher quality, lower costs, more value for money, to sum it up. And there is actually no good reason or no underpinning given for why this is expected, other than the belief that creating more business-like conditions for these organizations will sort of automatically lead to better value for money. And interestingly enough, we know very little about the results of what is actually achieved, whether this efficiency is achieved or not. And one of the few studies that has been done by Schors Overman, I've listed the reference down here, actually shows that more efficiency is not achieved. In fact, in many countries where a lot of agencies have been created, efficiency at the macro level has gone down. So there is not an immediate proof that these high expectations have actually been met. As far as political benefits go, it was expected that the creation of agencies would reduce the size of the government, because units of the bureaucracy were hived off, turned into agencies, and less political interference because of the distance, more transparent accountability. Again, little proof is available, but what we do know is that at least the less political interference has not been proven. In fact, a lot of agencies suffer from a lot of political interference, and politicians have proven to be not very good at keeping their distance from these organizations, which is a point I will return to later on. Then finally, the organization effects that were expected. It was expected that because of the more business-like management, the motivation of employees and therefore their productivity would go up, that they would be more motivated and that they would be more happy to be at work because their expertise and professionalism are rewarded with a certain degree of autonomy. We have very little academic evidence on this. I know of only 1 or 2 studies which have really mixed findings. So if any of you, I understand there are students in the audience, if any of you is maybe thinking about writing a thesis on agencies, this is definitely an effect that we know very little of and that would be worthwhile to investigate. So there were high expectations, but unfortunately we know very little about the results. And one of the main reasons why we know very little about the results is that there have been very few evaluation studies. So it's very important actually that we get more information to really find out whether all these expectations have been met or not. What we do know is that there have been some unintended results. So the creation of agencies has led to a large, what we call fragmentation of the public domain. All these single-purpose organizations are working independently from each other, not in collaboration with each other, and sometimes even in competition with each other, which has led to a lack of control by politicians, and particularly also a perceived lack of control. Many politicians feel that they are no longer in control of the public sector and of executive agencies, which creates a lot of unrest and a lot of incident-driven attention. Like I said, the political interference certainly hasn't gone down with the creation of agencies. There's a need now for coordination, to restore coordination. And as far as agencies are concerned, one of the responses that comes from the political center to these unintended results is the so-called de-agentification or rationalization of agencies. And I've brought with me an example from the UK, but this is a trend which is already going on in many countries at the moment, where agencies are actually reshuffled, given a different legal status, or taken back into the government. So in 2010, the Cameron cabinet at that time, ruling the United Kingdom, initiated the so-called bonfire of the quangos. And it was intended that particularly the number of non-departmental public bodies, which I will explain in a few minutes, but is a particular type of executive agency, would be reduced. And the number at that time was just over 900. And it was the target was that about a quarter of those organizations would be abolished or would be merged or would be taken back into the government. Now, in fact, that really didn't happen as much as it was intended. In the end, only 8% was abolished, and all the other organizations are still existing, sometimes in a merged form, but not really a big bonfire of the UK quangos. And one of the main reasons for that is that in Parliament, because these decisions have to be corroborated in Parliament because they are based on legislation, the specialists in the particular fields were not inclined to abolish the agencies in their own field. For example, a large group of these organizations operates in the field of health, and many of the health bodies could not be abolished according to the members of Parliament because they were needed, because they had to carry out all these very important tasks. So what we saw in effect was that the bonfire of the quangos went out with a big sizzle, and it didn't really amount to very much. And like I said, this is not unique to the United Kingdom, but this has happened in many other countries where these big operations of reducing the number of agencies was announced. Similarly, for example, in my own country, in the Netherlands, but also in countries like Hungary, Ireland, Norway, and Estonia, to give just a couple of other examples. Now, I've just mentioned these non-departmental public bodies, NDPBs in the UK, and that is one of the different types of agencies that we know. So in this COBRA network, we had the problem that we were with researchers from 30 different countries, and each country has its own different types of agencies. And how can you do comparative research between that? It's very difficult. There are also big differences between the countries when it comes to, for example, the rule of law or the particular state administrative system, etc. So we had to devise a particular typology, and you can see the result here on this particular slide. We had to come up with this typology to enable comparative research. Now, this is not a perfect typology. There are always organizations that do not fit very well into one of these three categories, but overall it seems to work, and it allows us to do comparative research between the different countries. So this typology distinguishes three different types, type 1, 2, and 3. We have not been very creative with naming them. And the first one is called, these are semi-autonomous organizations. They have no legal independence, so they are legally still part of the entity of the state, but they have some degree of managerial autonomy, mostly financial autonomy. So the BLU, for example, would fit into this category. In other countries, we find, for example, the so-called Next Steps agencies. That's in the UK. There are other types of agencies with different names in their own language in a number of the so-called continental European countries, like my own country, for example. So in the Dutch language, it would be agentschap, which sounds a bit similar like agency. The Nordic countries, they have the biggest group here, the state agencies. But for example, the Italians have the Agenzia. There are direct agencies of the federal government in Germany, for example. So many different types of organizations, most of which have no legal independence and have larger degrees of management autonomy, in particular financial autonomy. The second type is what we also call the statutory bodies. They are legally independent organizations. They have their own legal personality, usually based on statutes or on law. It could be public law, but it could also be private law. So in some cases, for example, foundations are actually part of this particular category. These organizations have larger degrees of managerial autonomy than the type 1 organizations. And the most familiar type here are the so-called public establishments. In most Southern European countries, we have these public establishments. The Italians have them, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, all have these public establishments. The Dutch ZBO category is in here, and the UK non-departmental public bodies I just mentioned. So these are a type 2 agency, as we call it. There are other statutory bodies in these other countries, but you have to be careful because the state-owned enterprises are in this category. So the type 3 organizations are particularly state-owned enterprises. And these can be found in all kinds of countries, and I'm sure you have a lot of them in Indonesia as well. So we use this typology to make comparative research possible. Now you can see that the typology is based on large degrees of autonomy, having more or less degrees of autonomy. But autonomy is a very tricky concept because autonomy has what we call is a multidimensional concept. There are many different types of autonomy, and organizations can have these different types of autonomy in varying combinations. That is, it is not always the case that if you have one type of autonomy, you will also have other types of autonomy. Or if you have more of this type, that you will also have more of that type. There are many different combinations, and in the research that we did, we found very typical combinations of organizations having large degrees of financial autonomy, but no degree of policy autonomy or human resource autonomy or legal autonomy. So that is not something which is automatically connected to each other, and you will have to study each organization individually to find out how much autonomy it has on these different aspects of autonomy. And there is more, because we've also found that the formal autonomy that an organization has because of its legal type, for example, and the actual autonomy it has in practice are often not the same. So sometimes organizations actually take more autonomy than they formally have, whereas other organizations get less autonomy than they formally have. And the latter is mostly because of the way that the ministry or municipality deals with these organizations, how much autonomy they actually give them in daily practice. So the style of the ministry, I called it here, that plays an important role in finding out how much autonomy an organization in practice has. And the political saliency, so the political attention given to a particular organization, is very important. If there is an incident, usually the direct reflex of the ministry or the municipality is to reduce the amount of autonomy that the organization has, to immediately intervene, take all kinds of actions, etc. Very important factor in this, in the relationship between agencies and their political masters, so to speak, is the history of the agency. For example, particularly the age of the organization. So how long it has been in existence, that is one of the contributing factors to getting more autonomy. And there is but one factor that we have found to be of some significance in determining the amount of autonomy that an organization has, which is financial independence. So organizations that are actually financed through tariffs that they can ask their clients, they usually have more degrees of autonomy than organizations which are financed through the state budget. That's the only factor actually that we find to be of importance. For example, the task of an organization, for example, if it is a regulatory agency or something, really doesn't play a role in determining the amount of autonomy it has, which is actually quite surprising because everybody would expect that regulators would have more autonomy because they have to be more impartial. So now I'm turning to the topic of management at arm's length, because the creation of agencies creates a problem for government. And governments, in this case, I'm talking about ministries and municipalities mostly. They don't have a hierarchical relationship, but then how do you manage these organizations at arm's length? And that's a big problem for many governments that they struggle with. And from a theoretical point of view, we use two models to model this relationship and also to base our recommendations on how to manage these organizations in practice on. So these two models both come from the economic theories. The first one is called principal-agent model, and the second one is called the stewardship model. And I'll explain both of these models and their implications for managing agencies at arm's length. So first we start with principal-agent theory. Now, principal-agent theory is based on a relatively simple idea, namely that you have two parties, a principal and an agent. So the principal is, for example, a ministry, and the ministry hires the agent, the agency in this case, to perform a particular task, which could be anything from social benefits to schools or anything else. And they agree to do that the agent will do this for a particular budget or for a particular reward. And this is all laid down in a contract, in a letter, which specifies what the agent will do for the principal. Now, because it is an economic theories always assume that people have what they call economic rationality. They have particular goals in life that they want to achieve, and they will do basically anything to get that, which is called the opportunistic behavior of actors. In this case, the principal will have his own goals, namely the policy to be implemented properly for as little cost as possible, whereas the agent has a different objective. The agent wants to get as much money as possible for doing as little as possible. That's the basic assumption in principal-agent theory. So they strike a deal, but the devil is always in the details, of course, because the agent knows much more about what needs to be done, how much it costs, how much time it will cost, etc., because the agent is the expert on this particular task. That is the whole reason why the principal is actually hiring the agent to perform this particular task. So this is called the information asymmetry. The information about what the task requires is not evenly distributed between the principal and the agent. The agent knows much more and the principal knows much less. And this could lead to two problems. And the first problem is called moral hazard. The moral hazard problem is when the agent performs much less than he should be doing and is getting more money than he should be getting for it. So this is sort of the opportunistic behavior of the agent. And the other problem is called adverse selection, because the principal doesn't know that much about the particular task. He also doesn't know really very well which agent is the best agent to hire for this particular task, which could mean that he's hiring the wrong agent. Now, I should mention that this is an economic theory, so it's based on market situations. In the public sector, there are, of course, a number of other complications, one of them being that there are only limited number of agents. For example, many agencies who perform public tasks are monopolists. So it's not like the principal has a large choice to choose an agent from. So this is a complication when you apply this particular model, but there are more, and I'll return to that in a couple of minutes. So this is the problem. The information is asymmetrically divided among the two, and this can create all kinds of problems. The principal is uncertain whether the agent will do as we agreed in the contract. And the main solution to this problem is that the principal will monitor the agent. That is, the agent will have to explain what he's doing, he will have to report on a regular basis, he will have to give an account for what he's doing on key performance indicators, and there are all kinds of rules and strict regulations that the agent has to adhere to. The other solution is called incentives, and incentives mean that, for example, you give the agent a small reward in case the agent does a very good job. For example, in the case of executive agencies, many executive agencies are allowed to retain part of the surplus of money of the budget that they achieve. So this is the way that the principal agent model assumes that a relationship can be at play. You will understand that this principle really is quite uncertain about what the agent will do and whether the contract will be fulfilled as was agreed on. In the stewardship model, which is the alternative model, this is a different situation. So in the alternative model, we still have a principal who hires an agency, but in this case, the agency is a steward. And the big difference between an agent and a steward is that the steward has the same objectives in life as the principal. So there is no divergence of objectives anymore. Therefore, although there is a deal, there is no devil involved. The information is still asymmetrically divided because the steward is still the expert. But because they have the same objectives, there will be no opportunistic behavior by the steward. So the problems of moral hazard and adverse selection more or less disappear in this relationship. But then you shouldn't be monitoring, because if you then monitor, that will create enormous problems. If you still keep on monitoring a steward, he will feel really distrusted, not relied on, and not acknowledged as a professional expert. If you want to steer a steward, you have to use very different instruments than you would do if you have a principal-agent relationship. So in a principal-agent relationship, you have all this monitoring going on with very detailed contract, with frequent exchange of information, also on details, on inputs, not only on outputs. You will restrict the agent from doing all kinds of other activities besides the ones for the principal, preferably not give him or a legal, independent legal position, maybe put a government representative on the board. So there will be lots of details regarding supervision and accountability to reduce the uncertainty of the principal about what the agent is doing. But in a principal-steward model, you will have to trust the steward. So trust is a very important steering mechanism in the principal-steward relationship. And you will not put government representatives on the board. You will not talk about details. You will steer on results rather than on inputs. There will be contact and there will be supervision, but in a very different way. So the principal will not maybe do the supervision himself, but will appoint like a board of overseers. There will be a frequency of communication, but on important topics, not on details. It will be a more business-like, equal kind of relationship. And this is a very big difference from the traditional way of steering, and something which appeals, in my experience, to many governments and many agencies, but in practice it turns out to be very difficult. And there is a catch. I've listed here, just for your information, a number of instruments that can be used in these relationships. Some of them are more fitted towards a principal-agent model and some to a more stewardship model. But I actually want to go to the next slide because I said there is a catch. The researchers that came up with the stewardship model, which is, they are listed here, David Shorman and Donaldson, they came up with this stewardship model, and they said that model will only work if both parties in the relationship choose the same model. You shouldn't be mixing these models. That will create monstrous hybrids, is the term I think they used. So if both the government and the agency choose a principal-agent relationship, then you will have a situation in which both parties don't trust each other very much. There is a high degree of monitoring and accountability, but each of them knows where they stand. And that can create some kind of equilibrium between the two. If both parties choose a principal-steward relationship, then you have a situation of mutual trust and respect, again, creating an equilibrium. The problems arise, according to the people who came up with the model, when you mix them. For example, if you have an agency which behaves like an agent, whereas the ministry expects the agency to behave like a steward, you will have high risks of corruption, of opportunistic behavior by the agency. So you will pay too much for too little as a principle. And if if the agent wants to be treated like a steward, but is in fact treated like an agent, then you have an agency who feels distrusted. And that leads to so-called dysfunctional relationships. And in fact, in my research into agencies, this is the situation that we most often encounter. Because in practice, we see that agency and stewardship models are often mixed. Even though theory says you shouldn't be doing it, in practice, we do see this. And I brought with me today an example from a student of mine who studied the relationship between municipalities on the one hand and theaters and concert halls on the other hand. Theaters and concert halls are local, often local agencies, most of the time in the form of a legal foundation. And she studied how these two parties see the relationship between them. And she actually found that the theaters and concert halls see the relationship slightly more as principal agent than as principal steward compared to the municipalities. It's interesting to see that the municipalities have a more positive relationship, more positive idea of the relationship than the theaters and concert halls have. Moderator, there is somebody who's raising his or her hand. Should I be answering questions now or later on? I don't mind either way, but
we will have a question and answer session later. I guess it will be better for us to have a question and answer session later.
okay, very good. I don't mind, but I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so what we see is that the governments, in this case the municipalities, have a much more positive idea of the relationship than the agencies in this case. So on a scale from 1 to 10, they said 7.6, and the theater and concert hall said 7.1, which is statistically significant. So they have a more positive relationship with governments. They think that they have a better relationship than the agencies actually indicate. What we also see is that if parties indicate that they have a stewardship type relationship, they are much more happy with the relationship than when they have a principal agent relationship. So these differences actually show that the municipalities have a more sort of positive take on their relationship with the agencies than the agencies in practice experience. And this is indicative of these dysfunctional relationships, which has been predicted by theory when you mix the two different models. So there's not that much research done yet on this topic. I know of a study in Norway. We've just recently published a paper on Australian agencies, and I've also done this work on the Netherlands. But this seems to be one of the sort of new features of these relationships at arm's length. Now, managing organizations at arm's length for government is not an easy task, apart from basing it on these two models. In the Dutch situation, and I think this is an interesting model for you to also get familiar with, the Dutch ministries in particular, they discern different roles in the management of agencies at arm's length. First of all, they are what they call the principal. So the principal is the one who's hiring the agent to do a particular job. They make the contract. They determine, for example, which are the policies that the particular agency has to implement. A second role that they identify is the role of the so-called owner. Now, this is a bit complicated because in a situation where you have to deal with a state-owned enterprise, it's obvious who the owner is. The owner is the one who owns the shares in the state-owned enterprise. But in the case of a type 1 or a type 2 agency, like a BLU or a ZBO in the Dutch case, it is a bit less clear. But we understand this ownership as in terms of sometimes economic, because the agency depends on the money it gets to do the particular task, and sometimes in a legal sense, because the organization is still part of the legal entity of the state. And in practice, this is the triangle which is used to describe the relationship between ministries and agencies, where the principal and the owner are both roles for the ministry, by different units within the ministry usually, and the agency is the role of the agent or the steward. Now, this seems like a relatively simple model. However, in practice, it's more complicated than that. First of all, because the government has more roles. The government is also supervisor of the agency, although it doesn't always do that itself. Sometimes it will appoint a separate regulator or an inspectorate to check out the agency. And of course, the government is also the protector of the general interest. So it doesn't only have to deal with this particular agency, but also with other agencies and also with other policies. So that complicates the model a bit. And there's another complication, which is that a lot of agencies actually work for more than one principal. So sometimes they work for multiple divisions within one ministry, or they even work for different ministries or at the local level for different municipalities. So that makes it a bit more difficult. And the principal, the government, ministry, or the local government has to decide what to do with these different roles. And there are two options that the ministry, the government has. First of all, they can try to separate these roles, which is the model which in the Netherlands at least is used most often. So the principal role is by a policy unit within the ministry, and the ownership role is usually by the financial unit. Sometimes another model is preferred where the roles are integrated and then a new unit is created, the so-called interface unit, which is actually sort of the main contact for agencies. And that interface unit will then discuss what is going on or what needs to be done with the different units within the ministry. So that's like an interface. But that's a very complicated role. We've seen several experiments with that, mostly unsuccessful in the end, because in the end, the policy units and the financial units are stronger and want to retain their own lines of communication with the agency. So this is a model that, at least in the Dutch situation, is used a lot for handling all contacts with agencies. I have been to New Zealand and Australia and the UK to also present this model, and there are different variants of these models present with different names, but in general, seeing these different roles and seeing these different lines of communication is something that is shared between governments from different countries. So if you decide to do these things, then what should you be doing? Because I'm already moving into the latter part of my presentation, which is lessons for practice. So if you want to be a good principal, like a ministry or a municipality, what should you be doing and what shouldn't you be doing? Well, first of all, what you shouldn't be doing is focus very much on the details and interfere and meddle all the time with these organizations. That will not create good relationships and that will not create effective agencies, so good performance. And very importantly, you shouldn't unilaterally renege or break contractual agreements that you've made. A lot of agencies in evaluations that have been done actually complain about the fact that they can never do their business correctly because the government changes its mind all the time. New coalitions, new governments come in, new budget restrictions come in, new policies come in, new tasks come in. This changes all the time. And that interferes with the business-like operations of these agencies. But what should you be doing? Well, you should use, for example, the new instruments that have been devised for the non-hierarchical relationship between principals and agents. You should let go, which is very important, but very difficult, particularly for politicians. You should respect the autonomy of the organization. If you've hired an agent to do a particular task, you should give the agency the leeway to do so. Both parties have to act in a professional and a more equal-like manner and invest in their relationship. Not only see each other when things go wrong, but see each other frequently and keep each other informed. In New Zealand, they have this principle, which is called the no surprises principle. In order to be able to be effective in policy implementation, it is important that policymakers and the agencies have regular contact and not only when things go wrong. And you have to find a balance between the different roles because the roles are not interested in the same things. The principal is interested in other things than the owner. And then to be fair, to be a good agency also requires a couple of things. What you shouldn't be doing is you should not be taking all kinds of risks without prior consultation. This is again the no surprises principle. You should not assume that the government will pick up the pieces or the bill when things go wrong. So if you've been granted autonomy, then be autonomous and manage yourself. And you should make sure that accountability and communication is a serious business and not something which is only done on paper, which is something that we do see in practice. What you should be doing is to be also sensitive about the political aspects and impact of your activities. Again, the no surprises principle is a very important one. Be open, not try to hide all kinds of things, which we currently see a lot of agencies do. And it's okay to be sort of open, or not sort of, to be open about what you're doing, not only to your ministry, but maybe also in general to your public, which is what we call, or what also call horizontal accountability. Invest in your reputation, in your legitimacy, in your stakeholder network, etc. And of course, very important, you should invest in the capacity of your own management. Now to sum up, because I think am I still on time?
Yes, you're still on time. You still have 5 minutes to go.
Okay, well, that should be enough for my last 2 slides.
Yes.
So a couple of lessons for practice. This is all based on the research that we and I have been doing and that we've been doing in the COBRA network. First of all, very important and not a very popular message, legal type doesn't really matter. That is, there is no best one type. There is also no relationship between the type and the performance of the organization or the way that it is managed. And this is something which is quite counterintuitive, because the legal form of the organization is often seen as a very important thing, and also a very easy way, I think is the best word for it, if you want to handle particular problems that have arisen with the organization or in the performance of the organization. So what you see is rationalization. I mentioned the bonfire of the clangos. That is seen as a solution to something, but it isn't, because the problem is actually almost never in the legal type of the organization. The problem is somewhere else, either in the quality of the policy that the organization is implementing, the conditions under which it is working, the level of trust and autonomy that has been granted. So those are all more often the causes of problems than the legal form of the organization. So reshuffling, de-agentification are not a solution to most of the problems that have arisen with agencies. And that's not a very popular message because, like I said, reorganization is usually the first instrument that politicians and ministries go for in dealing with problems with agencies. A second group of lessons for practice is that if you have new relations, like I said, not hierarchical relationships, that calls for new instruments and new models. And I've shown a couple of them, the ones that I'm familiar with. I'm sure that your own government has new instruments and models as well. It's important to invest in the relationship between governments and agencies, and particularly to build trust. And for politicians, this means learning to let go and to respect the autonomy of the agencies. And like I said, they find that very difficult. And I don't have I might be an optimist, but I'm not naive in believing that they will always let go. But the incident-driven attention now is not very productive. It's important to work on a systematic relationship and not only when there are incidents. And then finally, the third group of lessons for practice is that it is very important to invest more in knowledge about agencies and agencification, both for the government, but also more in general for the public, for example. It's important to learn more, but don't start copying practices and models and everything straightforwardly from one country to another or from one sector to another. It's always important to keep in mind that the particular context and traditions in a particular country or in a particular sector they have to be adapted to that. Invest in the skills of civil servants. They have to become more aware of what it means to manage these bodies at arm's length. And I've seen nice examples, for example, in the United Kingdom, they have created this handbook for civil servants, which explains everything about agencies you always wanted to know. But there are other sources, like, for example, evaluation reports, etc. So there are many different sources of information that can be used to invest in the skills of the civil servant. And then finally, invest in the management skills of the agency management as well, to take up their own role and to take their autonomy and professionalism serious. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was all clear, because it was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but we'll see when we get to the questions later on. So I give the floor back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Professor Sandra. It's a clear and interesting explanation, and there are a lot of lessons learned from what you explained. For example, like there is no panacea in semi-automatic agency, and then in order to guarantee the success of semi-autonomous agencies, the government should improve not only the skills of the employees, but also the management skills of the principals. We also learned about the concept of principal agent and principal stewards. Okay, that's a interesting discussion. Now we will continue with the second speaker, Ibu Ari Wahyuni, the Director of PK-BLU, Ministry of Finance. She will explain about Indonesian case, semi-autonomous agencies in Indonesia, especially about the basic conception, legal basis, and also the strategic development. Allow me to give short introduction about Ibu Ari Wahyuni. Her education, she pursued a master degree in the Master of Public Management in Carnegie Mellon University, United States of America. He obtained his bachelor degree in Faculty of Law, Diponegoro University, Semarang. Okay, please welcome Ibu Ari Wahyuni.
Thank you, Pak Agus. Dear Pak Rionald Silaban, Chairman of the Finance Education and Training Agencies. Also my boss, Pak Andin Hadiyanto, the Director Jenderal of Treasury. And Professor Sandra van Thiel from the Erasmus University with a really excellent presentation. And Pak Mas Budi Waluyo from PK-BLU. And also all seminar participants. It is a great pleasure to me to be able to speak in these forums regarding the semi-autonomous agency in Indonesia. First of all, I will begin my explanation briefly about the concept of BLUs in Indonesia, then the outlook of the BLUs and the challenges. I will start by fleshing out of the reasons why Indonesia chose to adopt the semi-autonomous agency and its effort to provide services to the public, and also risks and approaches that have been pointed out and suggested by the OECD and its 2002 paper. The concept agencies in Indonesia was designed by referring to the concept of the public agency in Europe. Public agency is perceived as a vehicle for government to improve financial management and control of public bodies. Based on OECD research back in 2002, the public agencies model has following characteristics. First, insulating decision from the politics, clear identification of responsibilities, better accountability schemes, increasing economic and efficiency, and introduction new management schemes. However, it is worth to be noted that there are several risks inherent in the public agency model. Thus, in the next slide, I will point out at least 6 risks surrounding the implementation of the public agency models that should be accounted by the policymakers or the governments. Learning from the overseas experience, which is from Europe countries, and from domestic experience, agree with the Sandra mentioned that there are several financial risks that can be identified and need to be mitigated as well. There are typical risks that may diminish the effectively of public agencies. First, illegal allocation of public money or misuse of public assets. Agencies may allocate public money for the purpose differently from those intended by government and parliaments. Agencies may convert public assets to uses different from those intended by the government and the parliament also. The second is the debt risk. The agencies may directly or indirectly increases public borrowing beyond limit approved by the government and the parliament. The third is the corrupt practices, as the Sandra mentioned, is a moral hazard. Agencies may engage in corrupt practices to the unjust enrich of ministers, employees, or favored friends, or make it more difficult to enforce existing anti-corruption rules. 4 is about the agency may serve as vehicles for the circumvention of financial and administrative rules by the parent ministries or other parties. And the 5th is agency finance may not be appropriate consolidated in the government financial report. 6 is a weak and absent accountability arrangement. Accountability arrangements such as the transparency, performance reporting, financial reporting, control, and audit may be weak and absent. Citizens' right to appeal and redress against agency decision may be compromised. And then the executive government may not retain adequate powers to impose remedies or sanction when the public agency fail to fulfill their responsibilities. Still referring to the OECD's paper, there are issues that should be considered by the policymakers or government policies who's trying to implement the public agencies model in this jurisdiction. Here, the issues are classified into the general and specific issues. The general issues is like a choosing, as there are 3, choosing and classifying agency models. It's like Sandra mentioned that the reformers should not import a foreign model, but seek to analyze the specific objective, risk, and management incentive that are most important in each countries, mentioned Indonesia, and or in-line ministries. Classifying the various possible models of semi-autonomous agency in accordance with the national priority and concern, and also choosing the appropriate degree of autonomy for a new agency should include an assessing of the associated financial risk. The second is about legal status. A key common distinction is agency establishment under company laws or other agencies. Distinction should pertain to the type of activities entrusted to the agency. And individuals or posts in line ministries or finance ministries should be clearly identified as a legitimate channel for the government supervisory action. Budget reviews and control. For agencies function under market condition, Government normally plays the same role as the shareholder as defined in the company laws or equivalent. Special features to cover risk for public finance, investment selection, control on overall wage cost, segregated business plan, and reporting for the public duties carried out by the agency, and also application of public procurement rule. For agencies depending on the state budget support, it's like budget formulation process should in the general follows the normal review standard applies to the traditional budget review and directly involve the finance ministry. Special attention should be paid to the oversight of staffing and personnel costs. And also the transaction preferable performed with the state treasury system. And then the second big issue is a special issue. There is 4 main issues is related with the real property asset. There is a risk that alienation or inadequate maintenance of national patrimony elements, that's the risk. And the suggested control arrangement and supervisor of the agency use of the real property asset to ensure strict confinement to the agency mandate. The second is agency revenue policy. There is a risk that agency output price at the unnecessary high levels. Prices not determined by the market discipline, not transparent price setting. So the control suggested arrangement is agency revenue policy subject to governance review in the context of annual budget or equivalent procedures. Full cost recovery as the basis for price setting. Cash programs administered on behalf of the government. There is a risk. Using a program's resources to cover agent running costs. So the suggestion control arrangement separate accounting for cash programs and for operating budget. And then the last is about the in-marking contribution. There is a risk, lack of definition or monitoring of in-marking contribution. So the suggestion control arrangement is in-marking distribution companies by written condition regulated by the finance minister. Donors monitoring and audit arrangement in place. Moving on from the concept of risk of the public agency model, next we will see how the ecosystem of BLU in Indonesia, how each actor in the ecosystem interact and interrelated with each other. In one ecosystem or governance to provide government services to the public. Next slide. There are 4 groups and institution ecosystem in BLU, namely regulators, operators, supervisions, and supporting professionals, so that BLU can carry out its duty, which is delivering services to the public. The definition of the responsibilities and division of authority between those stakeholders in the BLU ecosystem must be clear. In other words, a clear mandate for each stakeholders has to be established so that no overlapping function between them. That may be answered the question of the statement from the Sandra. Yeah. In the next part, I will summarize the key characteristics and features of BLU that differentiate BLU from the other government agencies. These characteristics and features are established in a legal frameworks, namely Law Number 1/2004 regarding with the State Treasury and the Government Regulation 23/2005 regarding with the BLU financial management. These regulations are the product of the state financial reform that took place several years after the reformation in early 20s and early 2000s. There are 5 basic characteristics of BLUs. First is government agencies, whose assets are inspired from the state assets. Second, provide goods and services which are wholly or partly sold to the public. Third, providing services to the communities and manage autonomously with the principle of business style like style efficiency and productivity. And also, this is not for profit. What makes BLU different than other government entities is the flexibilities on managing its resources, which is BLU income can be disbursed immediately. The uses of its asset can be optimized through partnership. BLU can use its cash surplus on investment. The remuneration itself, the remuneration of its staff can be established independent from its parent ministries. And BLU can recruit staff from professionals, not only civil servants. So in this next slide, I will briefly explain the life cycle of the BLU. As a government entity, there is a certain cycle of the process that BLU has to go through before it's established. The following cycle will give illustration how BLU is brought into existing and then operating to achieve its objective, until how the mechanism of monitoring and evaluation. It's all regulated in government regulation 23 and 2005. So you can see from the first of all, BLU proposed to prepare by respective inland minister until how the Ministry of Finance and the respective line minister are monitoring and evaluating the BLU operation. Moving on the form, the basic concept of the BLU, I will elaborate on the significance of BLU for the public and the governments. If we look the big picture of the government budget, BLU has the important and strategic role on the carrying out services of the public. It's like Pak Andin mentioned and also Pak Rio, that especially during the pandemic and supporting the fiscal sustainability of the country's budget. Fiscally, BLU has contributing non-tax revenues. In December, BLU's target on non-tax revenue has been exceeded, namely 69 trillion out of the 50 trillion target. So it's higher, 125%. In the next slide, we can see that BLU has covered the wide range of services, from the health services, education services, and other services such as fund and area management. As of 2020, there are 244 BLU under the central government, and around more than 1,000 BLUs from the BLUs under the local governments, spread across the countries in 20 ministries or agencies. The detailed example of how can BLU distribute on providing services and supporting development will be shown in the next part, especially in the health and education sector. Please show. BLU has a significant contribution on education and health services sector, as well as on empowering the micro, small, and medium enterprises, SMEs. On the social and fiscal development, increase the portion of the scholarship for the low-income students, providing social and health services during disasters, providing fiscal liquidity through cash optimization. And then next, I will show the data on how BLU can support itself over time and becoming less dependent to the state budget. As we will see, the ability of BLUs to carry out its function without adding more burden to the budget is increasing. Overall, BLU have becoming more efficient. Over time, the portion of Rupiah Murni funding for the BLU has decreased, while the portion of PNBP funding has increased. It reflects that the high independency level of the BLUs can provide services without add any additional burden to state budget. The road ahead for the BLU is still very long, actually. Although it has been 15 years since the semi-autonomous agency model is implemented in Indonesia, the challenges and uncertainties are still looming in the future of the BLU. Therefore, in the third part, I will point out obstacles and the plans for the BLU so it can keep moving forward and providing quality services to the public. The development of the BLU is pointing of this issue. First, strengthening the implementation of good BLU's governance. Second, comprehensive uses of the IT to support business process and BLU services. And then increasing the effectiveness of fund managed by the BLU and synergy and collaboration between BLU and BLUG. Moving from the current strategic plan, I will address the number of challenging for the BLUs and the current strategy of overcome those challenging. As the number of the BLUs countries is growing, the assets being managed are increasing as well. In the current economic condition, public expectation for the government services is higher. Meanwhile, BLU stakeholders have different level of understanding. So to overcome those challenging, we implement this effort. First, simplify the regulation pertaining to BLUs. Second, establish a maturity and capacity rating of BLUs. Make it the rating for the management. Preparing the service tariff index. Design a roadmap for IT master plan. So we have a dashboard so we can evaluate and monitor the 244 BLUs in Indonesia. And then also build a grand image of BLUs. So, and this, in the next slide, I will reflect back to the strategic role of the BLU, the challenging and also effort that might help the BLU to maintain its important role delivering services and driving the national growth. Target and strategic role of BLU of nation good, increasing contribution to GDP and national PNBP, improve general welfare through the provision and quality health of services, educating the national life through academic and professional education programs. These two concepts is the basic concept. And then equitable distribution and fulfill the people needs for research, telecommunication, and other fields. Challenging in improving the quality of public services, that we have to optimization, innovation, technology, and asset to increase the competitiveness of the BLUs. Standardization of the service rates and performance appraisal according to the nature of the BLU's business. Also, orientation in improving the quality of budget absorption. Creating a BLU's brand image as a public service provider. Those BLU requires organization transformation in order to realize good governance, superior human resources and integrated system, and affordable rates, and of course, the support from the SPE in creating accountability and transparency BLU governance. Okay, it's all for me. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Ibu Ari Wahyuni, for the nice presentations about Indonesian case related to semi-autonomous agency. Allow me to give some additional. So, according to Bu Ari, she explains about the ecosystem of the BLU, and then the characteristics of BLU, and also the positive contributions of BLU to positive contribution of the BLU related to the number of BLU and BLU days, local governments BLU. Test. Clear? Test.
It's clear, Pak Gede. It's clear.
Is it clear?
Clear.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Ibu Ari Wahyuni has already explained about the characteristics of BLU in Indonesia, including the goods and service productions, and then not-for-profit organization, and then the autonomous management, and also the conditions related to the state assets. And also, she explains about the positive contributions of BLUs in Indonesia, including the number of BLU, the development of BLU's number, and also the proportion of BLU funding sources, and also the effect to the societies. And then, now let's continue with the next presentations. Last but not the least, Bapak Budi Waluyo, the lecturer of Polytechnic of State Finance STAN. He will explain about the role of accounting in agencyfication. But first, allow me to explain about, to mention the curriculum vitae of Bapak Budi Waluyo. Bapak Budi Waluyo is a lecturer in Polytechnic of State Finance STAN. And related to his education, he graduated from Polytechnic of State Finance STAN in 2006, and then he continued his master's degree in Prasetya Mulia Business School, majoring in management or MBA, and then he just graduated from University of Leicester for the PhD degree in School of Business, PhD in Management. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bapak Budi Waluyo. Excuse me, Pak Budi, we cannot hear your sound.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Clearly?
It's not clear yet, Pak Budi. Maybe you can raise your volume.
It's 100% actually.
Okay, it's already clear, Pak Budi.
Okay then.
It's already clear.
Well, I will make a start on my presentation on the role of accounting in agencyfication context. So this is actually what I have done in my research, in my PhD research. So it explores the ethnography of agencyfication. I mean, this is okay. Can you hear me clearly?
Not clear, Mr. Budi. Please check your sound. No.
Okay. What about now? Okay. I'll try to follow on. So this is the use the result of my PhD thesis that I defended last July, and this is the back of evolution of research on resemblance the almost my
Okay, excuse me, Mr. Budi, Pak Budi. It's not your sound is not clear. Maybe can you turn off the video?
okay.
Sound.
Okay.
Okay, I guess Pak Budi Waluyo has a technical issue related to the network coverage. While waiting for the repairing the network issue, allow me to give some announcements. So there will be question and answer session after the presentations, and related to the slides of the presenters, we will provide the link after all presenters give the presentations. And then there is no attendance list related to the webinar. We will provide certificate claims at the end of the webinar, so in a limited time. Later we will provide it under the description in YouTube, PK Instan YouTube Live. And then we will invite one or two questions directly from the Zoom meeting. And then we also invite questions from Zoom. Maybe you can write down your questions in the chat, or if you are from YouTube Live participants, you can write down your questions in the comments, and then we will pick some of the questions to be answered by the speakers.
Gede, co-host apa bukan? Pak Gede, is it clear now?
Yes, it's already clear now.
Okay then. Thank you. Well, my apologies, participant. We got a small problem of internet connection, then it has been dissolved now. So I'd like to restart my presentation. This is my results of my research. Starting from the introduction, I would like to show the evolution of research on agentification that resemblances the data from Professor Sandra about the growth of the use of executive agencies or semi-autonomous agencies or whatever you name it, then it has been interesting for academics for publishing the research on this topic. So in terms of book chapter, journal articles, even PhD thesis. And secondly, based on the review on the literature, on the available literature, then I tried to narrow it down. The prominent research, the most influential research on this topic, which is including journal articles and books, and as well as book chapters, and we know the map of. From this table, we can see clearly that mostly the research on agentification has been done on European countries. So there are some of them try to understand and how the implementation of agentification in Asian countries, it doesn't include Indonesia in this sense. So let me jump into the motivation into the study that we already got a lot of insight from the previous research about how agentification is implemented in various countries. But I found the research got suggestion from from one of the prominent researchers in this field, in addition to Professor Sandra, of course. From Professor Polit, that they argued and they suggested in their research that a study into the micro level of agencies is rare. So that was the motivation of my study on understanding what is really going on in these agencies. So I try to describe my study by showing how is the practices of semi-autonomous agencies, and I'll be focusing on the use of accounting. I'll show you the definition of accounting in a minute, and then so the basic purpose of the study is to explore the interplay between accounting as the daily practice, and agentification as the context. So in the context of agentification, how accounting relates to this background. So I use a slightly different conceptual framework for this study. I mean, normally the study of agentification, as Professor Sandra has told us, that most of the study on agentification uses the concept of principal agent theories of several strands of economic theories, including principal agent and then principle of stewardship theories. But in this research, I would like to offer you the new way of understanding agentification using different perspectives. So I use several strands of theory of practice from Pierre Bourdieu for understanding what is agentification look like. So from this perspective, that agentification doesn't come from the principle of the new public management. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in NPM. It is the way I understand the agencyfication differently, rather than using the principal agent stewardship or institutionalist or isomorphism and so on. I try to use different way of understanding this phenomenon. So this enables me to look agencyfication as an environment. I mean, this is an environment that consists of a number of practices, including the dominant one in Indonesia, I'll be showing later on, is the practice of accounting. So it is built every day in the agencies by I'll identify in this research by observing the everyday practices of accounting in the context of agencyfication. Before going on, I'd like to explain that accounting in my study is defined in the wider sense of financial management. So we normally understand accounting as bookkeeping, as journaling, as reporting, but in this study, I define accounting as broad as I can to include all the different aspects of financial management. So it includes the financial management in the wider sense, financial reporting, of course, and performance contracting, how they use metrics, financial ratios, and the use of different financial measurements, as long as it doesn't deal with the financial market. So from this perspective, then accounting can be considered as a situated human action. So they do something in the daily practice, how to deliver the BLUs in the daily practice using this practice. So when we see agencyfication as a social world in which accounting takes place, then our perspective of agencyfication will be really different compared to the perspective of new public management. And for the sake of getting this perspective, in order to get those objectives, then I use a slightly different method for understanding this phenomena. It is called ethnography. In short, ethnography, it's about immersing myself into the field of research to understand what is really going on in there. So I'll be there when they was doing something. That is the short explanation of ethnography in terms of asking data or analyzing the data from outside the fields. I myself witness what is going on in the daily practice of the agencies. So I involved in their meetings, I involved in their verification, I've involved in when they was doing payment, how they do the documentation. So I was there between them. So that is the concept of ethnography. In order to understand what is going on in the field, so the researcher went to the field to immerse themselves in a considerably long period. So I was I took this field work in 2018 for 8 months, 7 or 8 months or so in 5 different agencies, as well as in the Ministry of Finance. And this is the preliminary data I got from the field, from the observation. What are they talking every day? So from the tree map, you can see the black font is for the Indonesian word, and then for the blue font or blue sentence or blue word is for the English. So we can understand that most of them, of course, they will mention BLU at any time they discuss with me, they talk with me, or they talk with the others. But we can find that a lot of them, they talk about finance, they talk about treasurer, they talk about funding. So it's almost all about the calculation or the calculative practices in the agencies. And what's the finding anyway for the, I'll try to make it short for you because we have already too much time on the screen. So I witnessed what's like to be a financial manager, for example. Then I found how they every day deal with trouble. They have to manage themselves. They have to be familiar with, to be a friend with the trouble. And the second, let's say, main player in the agency, I found a treasury or expenditure, that they undertake a high risk job, because managing a fund or managing money in the agencies always involve a lot of responsibilities. With the higher expectation to deliver payment faster, then, but on the other hand, they have to stay accountable. Then this is a really difficult choice for them to deliver their service to the internal or external party faster, but on the other hand, accountability measure is still in place. And for the third one, the third actor in the agency, I found for the treasurer of revenue, this is a matter of hugely daily reports that they have to deal with every day, every single day, even on holiday. So this is what they need to deal with in terms of managing, because BLU, they are managing their own revenue. So this is the main source of their revenue. They have to manage it accountably. So what does it mean to be semi-autonomous agency? This is from the concept, from the theory, that they habitualize what is important and what is not important. What is the best practice to serve better, to serve faster, and on the other hand, they keep it accountable. And the next one, about the interesting fact about the practice of agencyfication in Indonesia, that it involves performance contract signing. So we have a tradition that performance contract is not only about the explicit purpose of relationship between principal and agent, that your principal delivers or asks you to do the things in the performance document, your target, your performance indicator, what is the measurement or the criteria of measuring the successfulness of those targets. It is not only about the contract, but also in Indonesia, we put it in different context to accommodate, to adapt with our tradition. And this is one of the unique tradition, I can tell you, that in Indonesia's practice of performance contracting, there is a ritual of signing the contract. And I found this is almost exactly the same thing. We do this every year. Annually, at the beginning of the year, we will do a performance contracting to allow all the BLUs to come to the Ministry of Finance, and then they will attend a ritual, a meeting to sign all together the performance contract between the BLU representative and the representative of the Ministry of Finance. Usually the Director of PK-BLU and the Director General of Treasury will be the representative of the Ministry of Finance. But in addition to this tradition, then we put this as a ordinary practice that is not really essential, but this is what we will call this as a legitimate practice. It seems it doesn't legitimate contract when we don't take it into the signing ceremony, into the signing ritual in the beginning of the year. So that is a unique practice in Indonesia, as we normally did this every year, but for the international comparison, let's say, to the other countries, there is no such thing in the other countries. And I found interesting result from the survey for my study when I asked them about what will you ask for when you need to know more about BLU, about when you got a trouble, when you need more information on this. And I found the important role, the essential role of the Directorate of PK-BLU. So Ibu Ari and the team, you have a really essential role into informing the BLU staffs and managers and how they solve the problems. And also at some points, this is for the supervisory role within the agencies, and at some point this is for the academic roles into explaining what is really the concept of BLUs and what is the way of overcoming the problems that probably happening. And even this is bigger than the parent ministry itself. So the Ministry of Finance, especially the Directorate of BLU supervision, has a significant role, has a really essential role in nurturing, in supervising the BLU for the central government in Indonesia. And for the role of accounting in this sense, that I found the dominant role of accounting in agencification. So agency managers and staff, they try to generate everything using accounting. I said accounting in the widest sense of financial management. And then from this study, I found as well about the powerful of accounting into imposing the patterns of autonomy and control in the agency. So BLUs in Indonesia, they use different or special chart of accounts in accounting terms, and then financial representation. In the past, BLUs had to produce different financial reporting, but now it has been simplified into a single reporting. So that is part of the vocabulary of agencification in Indonesia. And this has come to the management of the BLU itself, that it advocates management by accounting, by introducing the accounting techniques and then accounting procedures and then accounting-based measurements we use in the performance contracting, and then how we try to adopt business-like accounting practices. And I think it is more interesting when we try to understand that BLU rationalize that financial representations, financial representation in a simple explanation, you can understand this as financial statement. So financial statement is the truest and the most effective ways of evaluating the BLUs. And this is, I found the interesting fact about the role of accounting in agencification in Indonesian context. And this is the conclusion of my study, that several BLUs, they have a different structure, and then they have different routines, different arrangement, but this tends into the similar end by using the accounting as a managing tool. So they manage BLUs using performance metrics, numbers, and then all the calculation into pursuing what is the purpose of agentification, or what does it mean to be semi-autonomous agencies by imposing all the criteria. We can consider this as accounting. So this is when the involved actor in the agentification, or in BLU, that agentification, the creation of semi-autonomous agencies, gives way to accounting-led agencies. I mean, accounting-led agencies, that is more or less about the really dense practice of accounting, financial management, and calculation in the specific settings. And this is to argue that everyday accountings in the agencies are consequential in structuring the contours of agentification. And lastly, as normal PhD research, then I would like to show you the contribution of the study. So from theoretical perspective, my study tried to provide different analytical framework to reveal how accounting practices are organized. I mean, in the context of reform movement, then this study look at the accounting side. So what is the accounting perspective on this reform movement? And for practical or practitioners, then from this study, we can learn that although managing government institution is about implementing the rule, and the space for innovation, space for discretion is limited, but how this space is used by the agencies is really important. So we all understand that BLU is not really autonomous agencies. I mean, their autonomy is limited, but this is not about how the limitation, not about the limitation of the autonomy, but how to allow them use this small space, this limited space, to allow them become what is expected as semi-autonomous agencies, into providing better public service, into providing faster service, and also contributing to the revenue generation for funding the public service. I think that's all from my study, and then thank you for having me today. I over to the moderator, Pak Agus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Budi Waluyo. Unique and remarkable presentations. So he tried to capture the concept of agentification from the accounting, from its widest sense. And then he said that the agentification, it's not only from principle, or it's not merely from the principle, but it can be built every day from, let's say, the ordinary actions or daily practices. Okay, we have reached the end of the main presentations. After this, we will continue with question and answer sessions. But first, allow me to explain again that the link of the materials will be provided in the description of YouTube. And then there is no list of attendance, but if you want to claim the certificate, I will mention the link, and then I will also write down the certificate claim link in the chat. Okay, I would like to invite one participant to ask directly in the Zoom meeting, and then after that, I have already obtained 3 questions from Zoom and also from YouTube. Okay, Bapak Iskandar has raised the hands. Okay, please.
Thank you, Pak Agus. Could you hear me?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, thank you. I would like, I have some questions for Sandra.
Bapak Iskandar, please mention your units maybe, and then that you can ask questions directly.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm Iskandar. I'm from DG Treasury. So I'm Bu Ari staff at the PK-BLU. So I have some questions for Sandra. And first of all, I like to say thank you to Sandra for the remarkable presentations. And yeah, since it's really close to my job at the office, I have a couple of questions that I need to just to clarify things to you. One research suggests the concept of post-new public management to overcome the unintended result that you mentioned, which is the fragmentation and lack of control and coordinations. So how do you see this concept? Is it new concept or just like they try to improve the, or just filling the gap that you just mentioned before? And I also, I read a book published in, it's quite old, 1997. So in that book, World Bank suggests that the implementation of new public management needs to be introduced carefully. I will say the direct quotations, where countries has been unable to establish credible control over inputs, giving managers greater flexibility will only encourage arbitrary actions and corruptions. What do you think about it? Is it still the case since it's already like more than 20 years? Is it still the case for the implementation of new public management in such countries? Or yeah, I would like to hear your opinion on that one. And also you mentioned about the principal agency and principal stewardship that you mentioned in your presentation. Is it the thing that we as a government, while we appoint an agent or when we want to do the agentification, is it we have to clearly define the type of relationship, or it's just the phenomena that we're going to see during the implementation of the agentifications? And for the last one, I'm curious about the politician that you mentioned in your presentations. Is it like the parliament of, like the parliament of member of parliament, the legislations, or the government itself? Because in Indonesia, some of the BLU, it's predetermined by the law, which is basically is the agreement with the lawmaker. So is it the case, or politician is about the government itself as a principle? I think that's all my questions. Thank you very much for the time, and again, congratulations for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Iskandar. If I'm not mistaken, there are 4 questions. First, related to post-new public management. The second one related to controls. The third one, let's say the concept of principal agent and principal stewards. And the last one, the politicians, the concept of politician itself.
Yeah, I'll try to be
please.
I'll try to be brief in my answer. interestingly enough, I had a slide on post-new public management in my presentation, but when I reviewed it, I thought it would be too long, so that's why I took it out. There's a range of post-new public management ideas and theories going on. At the moment, one of the most popular ones is about the whole of government to restore coordination. And there is the public value management idea that it should not be about economic value of public services, but about the public interest. And these are all responses to the problem of fragmentation, which is caused by new public management and in particular by agentification. Yes, they are responses. Whether they will solve the problem is not immediately clear to me yet, because I find that a lot of these post-new public management theories, while being very attractive ideas and very intuitive ideas, they are not very concrete ideas yet. So the only response I found very concrete so far is the de-agentification trend, which is part of the whole of government idea. But that's so far the only concrete response I found to the problems caused by new public management. I hope that answers your question. You say that you refer to an older book about the fact that the implementation of new public management gives leeway to all kinds of reduced control and potential opportunistic behavior by agents. Is that something? Is that an old idea, or is that still going on? Well, in essence, if you follow the logic of the principal agent model, it is still a current problem. So yes, it can still be going on, and that's why a lot of governments invest so much in monitoring, in accountability requirements, reporting, performance indicators, and so on. There is a big difference in the level of corruption, if you want to go that far, between countries. So the lessons I've learned are mostly about European countries, which have very different state traditions and very different levels of corruption, usually low levels of corruption. But I know, for example, that there has been research into how the implementation of new public management has led to corruption in, for example, a country like China. The privatization of services, for example, there is known to lead to corruption, not in all cases, but there have been cases documented and described in the literature. There are a few examples in the Western world, but not that many. I won't exclude that it happens there, but it's not been reported that often yet. So that is still a problem which is still going on, which leads me to your next question about the relationship between principals and agencies, either as agent or as a steward. I sort of summarize your question as to who defines which relationship you have and at what time. My recommendation has always been, also based on the parliamentary inquiry I did in the Netherlands, that you should actually talk about this before you create the agency. So in the preparation of the decision to create an agency, you should already talk about the relationship, and you should do that together, not just the government deciding we will have this kind of relationship. No, you should do it together, because just like between humans, if you want a good relationship, between two people, you should have both people on board and both people involved in talking about, what are the basic principles that we agree on and what are the kind of practices that we want to have, etc. So for me, it would be as early as possible, but always a joint effort. And then finally, you ask a very good question about politicians, because I've sort of been a bit vague about that. There are different political principles, and if you really want to delve into the models, you should actually make a distinction between different political principles. There are the members of parliament who are involved in legislation on individual agencies or on agencies as a category of organizations. There are the ministers who are very important and at the head of the ministry, but the ministers are also political principals. So it depends slightly on who you're talking to, but I didn't want to complicate the model that much. But if you really look into it, you actually have to make that distinction. And you see that, for example, in the American literature, that distinction is always made, because there the difference between the presidential executive powers and the legislative powers of the House of Congress is very, very important. So they will always make that distinction. For the Dutch case, I should actually also make it. It depends slightly on the state tradition in each country. I hope that answers your questions.
Okay, Bapak Iskandar, is it already clear, the answer from Professor Sandra? Okay, I guess.
I think he was nodding, so I think we can assume that it was okay.
Okay. Yes. Okay, let's continue with the 3 questions from Zoom and also from YouTube. The first questions is for Professor Sandra. According to you, what is the key of practicing management through principles with agency or even steward, so that they become more responsible in terms of mutual trust and mutual motivation among staff in order to make management better in a country? And then the second question, and actually how a management in a country can be considered as a good management. Is there a category for that? Thank you. It is from Camilla Scientist Sani. That's the first question. The second question for all presenters from Bapak Budi Mulyana. Question 1, how can agencies best be steered? The second one, under what conditions do agencies perform best? And then the last one, questions from Bapak Ihsan Masa Karundeng. It is for all presenters. Is the relationship between shareholders as principals and management as agents in Indonesia considered good enough? Is there nothing wrong with learning from 21 Western countries delivered by Professor Sandra regarding the ways and progress of these countries to become more advanced? Okay, let's invite Professor Sandra first to answer those 3 questions, and then it will be followed by Ibu Ari, and then the last one, Bapak Budi. Okay, please.
Okay, I'll start with the question you mentioned first. I've sort of summarized it into what is actually good management and what is key to good stewardship, and how do you create trust and motivation.
Yes.
So what is good management? Is there an indicator for that? I don't think so. For me, usually a good management, as in terms of how do both parties appreciate the relationship, is a more qualitative measurement. So you ask, how do both parties appreciate the relationship? Are they satisfied? Are there any conflicts? What's going on? Do people actually trust each other? Of course, you can have indicators like, if there are requirements for accountability, is information delivered on time and to the satisfaction of everybody? So what I see in evaluation studies, for example, is that it is a mixture of qualitative and quantitative information, but it is an individual mark. So it's very difficult to have good management of a country. What is key to good stewardship? That's the $1 million question. That's something that a lot of governments are struggling with. And like I said, I was invited to come to New Zealand and Australia to give lectures on that. And they are one of the countries that have actually already invested in stewardship, in their legislation for, it's the so-called PGPA Act on the statutory bodies in Australia, the NCCs and the CECEs, and that's all the technical details. So that's quite difficult. It does require a very different attitude from governments, in particular political principles, governments as a whole, towards agencies. Like I said, letting go is one of the key features, and that's very difficult for politicians and for ministries to do. But I've often made a comparison with what I call the empty nest syndrome. Those of you who are slightly older and have maybe adult children will know that if the children leave home, you always keep on worrying about, whether they will be doing fine or not, etc. But you should also know that it doesn't make for good relationships if parents keep on interfering with every detail of the life of their children who are now adults. And that psychological mechanism is actually what is often going on between governments and agencies. The governments keep on interfering with all the micro level things which they probably shouldn't be interfering with, because these are autonomous, semi-autonomous organizations. And so that's a very sort of important thing. Governments have to look at themselves. They have to decide, okay, so we are now a principal, we are on an equal footing. So that requires quite a different relationship than we may have had before. And that change in the behavior is very important, also in the case of parents and children, to create better relationships. How can agencies best be steered, and under which conditions do agencies perform best? Unfortunately, we know very little about the performance of agencies because there is such a lack of evaluations. The late Christopher Pollitt, who was already referred to by Budi, did a big study together with Soren Dam, one of his PhD students, into evaluation studies of the new public management in 20 countries. They collected about 600 reports, and they showed that there is very little information about actual performance of agencies in there. I've written a paper on why that is. Why is there so little attention for evaluation? And one of the reasons could be that the political principals, being both politicians in parliament and ministers heading the ministries, might not be so interested in knowing about actual performance, because if it didn't work out, if the agencies are not doing well, then it will hit them on the head and they will be held accountable for that. So that's called blame avoidance as an explanation for the lack of evaluations. But the lack of evaluations makes it very difficult to say how agencies actually perform and when they do perform best. So that's quite difficult to say. How can agencies best be steered? That's a very complicated question. I don't think that we will have enough time to go into all the details of that. But it depends on whether you talk about external management, i.e. by the ministry, or the internal management of the agency. The internal management of the agency is there's not much research into that yet, because that's an interesting question. You are expected to be more business-like, but at the same time, you have a public task and you work in a public sector and you work under political attention. So handling that together has not been studied very often. So I don't know enough to give you a solid answer to that either. I'm sorry to say, but again, there are many students in the audience. So please, students, if you're going to write a thesis, do it on these kinds of topics. And then finally, can Indonesia, how would I rate Indonesia's performance regarding BLUs, and what can we learn from other countries? Like I said, you can learn a lot from other countries. I've mentioned a couple of examples that I think are really worthwhile, like the UK handbook or the New Zealand no surprises principle. However, you always have to be careful when you imitate practices from other countries, because It will only work if it fits with your own traditions and with your own administrative and legal structures. So yes, you can learn from other countries, but be careful, not imitate straightforwardly. And how does Indonesia do, as in terms of the management? I think that is a question that Budi can probably answer a lot better than I can. But the impression I got, if I have to be honest, is that it is still a lot of principal agent mode. There is not a lot of stewardship mode going on yet, but I might be deceived by all the rules and regulations that I saw, and the story that Budi told about the big ceremony signing the contracts, which I thought was quite nice to hear. But that would be my sort of very shallow opinion based on what I've just learned through the seminar. That's it from me from now.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sandra, for the clear answer. And then next, I would like to invite Ibu Ari to answer question number 2 and question number 3.
Yeah, thank you, Mas Agus. Maybe I can summarize from these these 2 questions actually. There is interesting actually from the Sandra's question, Sandra's answer, and also from the question from our friends that actually I'm agree that the concept of the agency in each countries cannot be copied. Yeah, so each countries has a different structure and different terms to be trying to implement the concept to be the agency, the concept, the new autonomous agenda. The point of view is while we try to, the interesting is in 2004, yeah, 2004, while the law in Article 68 and 69 appear, there is from our previous leaders mentioned that in Indonesia, the reforms include the introduction of the semi-autonomous agencies model is appear in Indonesia, which is transform public services provides into a new governance. So we call it BLU right now. And then the consequences of the flexibilitas to the agencies, we have many flexibilitas to that agencies right now. Yeah. Then and this area, with all we already have 2,244 BLUs, with the range of understanding, it's really different. So the big question is about understanding and the race there. As I mentioned before, that there is at least 4 race that has to be mitigated. So that's why as a regulators, we try to make it that concept, it's what we call it, it's in line with the previous concept, that with the previous goal, that to push to make it the service is better than by using a usual satker. Yeah. By using the regulation and then make it by using the regulation that make it the regulation to make it all of the operators, we call it the operators, understanding the concept of the BLUs. So hopefully many moral hazard, let's say, or many obstacles that come up while we use the usual satker, it can be a break. That's maybe can answer the question, I think. Maybe from me, Pak Agus.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibu Ari. Now, next, we will continue with Pak Budi Waluyo to answer question number 2 and number 3. which is about the question from Pak Budi and Pak Ihsan. Okay, please.
Thank you for the questions, and I'd like to add some different insight. I think Bu Ari has addressed all the condition in Indonesia. So regarding the relationship between the stakeholders or the principal and the agencies, how was it our practice? Then I found from my previous research, actually, this is different from my PhD study. I found from a previous research that we have a different expectation about the autonomy. So in short, that agency expects more autonomy, but then principal only gives them limited autonomy. This is the thing that we need to aware of, that the different expectation might result conflict between them, because the agencies, they expect higher autonomy. They expect more flexibility in managing finance, in managing their daily operation in general. So this needs to be addressed by policymakers and by the agency or the principal, and they need to aware that the autonomy for the BLU is limited, and this is the basic concept that we need to always deal with. And then from this, for example, then this is from the interview. Then one of them told me about when they need to build a different service, which is considered out of the core of service, out of their core of service. Universities, their core of service is providing education. But then as a semi-autonomous agencies, then they want to generate more revenue by delivering services out of the educational matters. So for example, they do a business building a shopping mall, or for using their properties, and this is the issue. This is the issue for the agency and the principal, and also the policymakers. And I think for the purpose of addressing what is the concept of agentification has been translated in Indonesian context, I think if you are interested in studying this topic, then you should read one journal article by Professor Sandra. I remember the title. It is more or less about one size doesn't fit all. So basically it says that model of executive agencies or semi-autonomous agencies, or whatever you name it, it doesn't fit for all the arrangements, all the agencies arrangements. And this really essential for Indonesian context, that BLUs in Indonesia are really diverse, from the state universities, and then state hospitals, and then for the fund management, for the revolving fund, all of them, they are implementing the same concept, implementing one or the same regulation, or couple of regulation, I would say. And this is the challenge for the government, for the policymaker, how to generate, how to impose same regulation into different businesses, let's say, or different core of services, different types of agencies. And on the other hand, they have a really different in terms of size, in terms of resource, I mean, the budget, and then the human resource in terms of the assets, and so on. So they are diverse in a core of service, and then they are diverse in size. This lead to more complicated on how to really generate better regulation for the BLUs. That's from my perspective. Over to you,
Okay.
Pak Agus.
Thank you very much, Pak Budi, for the answer. It's clear and also concise, answering the questions from Pak Budi and Pak Ihsan. Now we have reached the end of our webinar. Allow me to conclude. As explained by Professor Sandra, Ibu Ari, and also Pak Budi Waluyo, one size doesn't fit all, or let's say we have learned from across countries practice related to the semi-autonomous agencies that we need to, especially in Indonesia, we need to invest more or do research more related to the best ingredients, referring to the best semi-autonomous agencies. For example, related to the flexibility, the autonomy, and also the relationship between principal and agents or stewards. And we have already shown the link of the materials and also the link of the form of the evaluation in the chats and also in the YouTube chats. So please, we will open the evaluation form, let's say in 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes, and we will close the evaluation form to claim the certificate. Okay. Now we have reached the end of the Pijar International Webinar 2020, which is also the last webinar held this year. I would like to pay my deep respect to all prominent speakers, Professor Sandra, Ibu Ari, and Bapak Budi, and also the webinar participants, whether in Zoom or in YouTube Live, for the invaluable presence and also insightful discussions on the topic semi-autonomous agencies, practices, and challenges. We greatly appreciate the support we have received from Directorate General of Treasury, specifically Directorate PK-BLU, and also from Financial Education and Training Agency. We are also grateful to all those who have been involved in the organization of the webinar. Lastly, I would like to close my remarks and also officially announce the end of webinar. Thank you very much. See you next year.
Bye, bye. Thank you, Pak Agus.
Thank you, Ibu Ari.
Ya, sorry. Tadi aku ninggalin